Fear is always present like a faint shadow clinging to every human footstep. Since we were small, we feared the dark, feared losing our mother, feared pain, feared being abandoned. When we grow up, that fear only changes its form and shape. Fear of failure, fear of poverty, fear of death, fear of oblivion. But few have ever stopped to ask what fear is, where it comes from, and why we cannot escape it. Many people think fear is a natural survival response, that we fear in order to protect ourselves. But if observed closely, fear is not that simple. It is not just a physiological reflex. It is a deep psychological structure nurtured by memory and familiarity. When we are afraid, in truth, we are not afraid of the unknown. We are afraid of losing the known, losing the things that once gave us a sense of safety, of familiarity. People often speak of fearing death, but does anyone truly understand what death is? What we fear is not death, but the dissolution of what we once called us. We fear losing this body, fear losing loved ones, fear losing reputation, assets, memories, everything that define the self within us. That fear takes root so deeply that even when speaking of liberation, we still silently cling to the concept that there will be a me that is liberated. Fear is tied to the known, and it is precisely that which prevents us from ever touching the unknown, touching true freedom. When we are afraid, the mind immediately returns to memory, compares, interprets, and seeks a way to escape that feeling through familiarity. But that very escape makes the fear stronger. Observe, when fear rises, the mind immediately reacts. It finds reasons, casts blame, analyzes, explains. But in that very process, we are reinforcing the fear, making it more real, more solid. Because every explanation is based on memory, and memory is the land of the known. People often seek freedom from fear by accumulating knowledge, beliefs, religion, or by escaping reality. But all of those are merely false exits, because within the act of escaping always hides the very seed of fear. Fear cannot be erased by will, nor can it be overcome by thinking. It can only dissolve when we see it completely, without judgment, without naming it, without trying to fix it. The origin of fear lies within our very conscience, that which we think is like, but is actually a collection of so many conditions, standards, and beliefs accumulated by society, religion, family, and personal memory over time. We call it morality, consciousness. I know what is right. But that very I know is the beginning of all fear. Because when we believe we know, we immediately fear losing that knowledge. Fear of being wrong, fear of being judged, fear of falling into the unknown. The known is the safety zone, while the unknown is the abyss. And we stand on the edge trembling, clinging tightly to every concept of the self because we believe that if we let go, we will fall. But do we ever realize? It is precisely because we cling that we cannot fly. Fear cannot be healed by reassurance. Reassurance is just a layer of paint covering it up, while underneath, the lava still flows silently. People pray, chant, perform rituals, hoping their minds will be at peace. But any peace that comes from an intentional act is temporary, because deep down, it is still built from the need to escape fear, and thus, the fear remains intact. Fear does not come alone. It brings with it the desire for certainty, the desire to know, to be safe. When we lose the sense of control, we panic, but life, in its essence, is always uncontrollable. That very uncontrollability is reality. So why do we try to resist what inherently cannot be changed? Freedom from fear does not lie in eliminating fear, but in understanding it. Understanding not with the intellect, but through pure observation. When we simply look at fear without labeling it, without naming it, that fear begins to disintegrate, because it only exists in the darkness of ignorance. When the light of awareness shines, that darkness has no place to cling. When fear is seen completely, there is no one left within us trying to control or suppress it. At that moment, it is no longer an enemy to be destroyed, but becomes a mirror reflecting the mind. In that mirror, we see every movement of thought, of memory, of identification with the ego. We begin to realize that the very clinging to the known is the root cause preventing fear from ever disappearing. When humans believe they can master fear through knowledge, belief, or religion, they are actually building a new wall around themselves. That wall is called understanding, experience, my own truth. But every brick in that wall is created from memory and the desire for safety. So it only deepens the fear. We accumulate to feel assured, but the very act of accumulation nurtures insecurity. We believe that if we have more wealth, more relationships, more knowledge, we will no longer be afraid. But in every step of that accumulation, a silent voice speaks up. What if I lose it? That very question is the seed of fear sown into every seemingly harmless action. Fear does not only lie in great things like death or disease. It hides in the tiniest details of life. We fear being forgotten by others, fear being misunderstood, fear of being looked down upon, fear that we are not good enough. And in every such fear, there is a common point. We fear losing our image in the eyes of others. The essence of fear, therefore, does not lie in the outside world. It lies within the very image that the mind has created of the self. That image is embellished by the past beliefs, roles, morality. That is precisely what we dare not let dissolve. Because if we lose that image, we feel we are no longer anything. And that feeling of being nothing is what humans fear most. But is being nothing truly that scary? Or is it the door leading to freedom in the depths? We fear emptiness, fear the void, fear losing control. But if observed closely, all human suffering and conflict stem from the effort to fill that emptiness with something: wealth, beliefs, religion, ideals, love. We never stop long enough to look straight into that void, because looking into it is looking into pure fear itself. And when we don't look, we begin to accumulate. We accumulate experience to avoid repeating pain. We accumulate beliefs to feel protected. We accumulate reputation to prove our existence. But with every accumulation, we lock ourselves in another layer. Fear becomes a prison, and we are the ones who built it. Many people ask, how do we not fear? That question contains a paradox. Because when we want to not fear, we are already afraid. Fear cannot be driven away. It can only be understood. And understanding here is not interpretation, but seeing. Seeing in silence. Seeing in the moment fear is operating within us. Seeing without needing a conclusion. When a person truly sees in a flash, the entire mechanism of fear becomes transparent. We realize that fear is not a separate entity. It is the movement of thought about loss, thought about the future, thought about the self. When thought stops, fear has no ground to live on. True understanding is not the effort to eliminate fear, but the seeing that the effort itself is the source of fear. This is the deepest paradox of spiritual life. The more we try to reach peace, the further we move from peace. The more we want to be liberated from fear, the more we are bound within fear. This does not mean we should give up. On the contrary, it demands a kind of subtle and courageous wakefulness. Wakefulness not based on will, but based on total attention. When the mind is completely attentive, there is no longer an observer and an observed object. Fear dissolves into the vast space of awareness. From that moment, fear is no longer a problem to be solved. It is simply a part of the movement of life, appearing and then dissolving like a small wave on the surface of the sea. And we are no longer swept away by the wave. We are just the silent, immense, nameless sea without fear. Suffering, a word seemingly everyone understands, but when observed deeply, it is as immense as the ocean. No one in life escapes suffering, whether rich or poor, intellectual or ordinary person. But few ever ask why we suffer, and why we fear suffering so much. Physical pain we understand as a natural reaction of the body, but mental suffering is different. It does not lie in the flesh but in the mind. It stems from the excessive attachment of humans to what they love, trust, or consider their own. We suffer when we lose loved ones, suffer when we fail, suffer when we are betrayed. But deeper than all is that we suffer when our image is damaged. A person insulted by others feels pain not because of the words but because the ego is touched. We believe we are someone, have value, have honor, and when that image is impacted, the mind reacts with pain. In that reaction, fear is born again. We fear being hurt again, fear facing that feeling. So we build walls to shield ourselves, accumulating to prevent it. We accumulate wealth to avoid poverty. We accumulate experience to avoid mistakes. We accumulate beliefs to avoid doubt. But that very act of accumulation is the root of suffering, because every time we hold tight, we fear losing, and when we fear losing, we begin to worry, defend, doubt, compete. The vicious cycle of fear and suffering continues to operate. People often confuse accumulation with peace. They think having many things will make them safer, happier. But if observed closely, the more we have, the more we fear. Those with money fear losing money. Those with power fear losing power. Those with fame fear losing fame. Accumulation is a form of fear in disguise. Suffering is not just the consequence of loss. It is the result of resistance to loss. Life always operates according to the principle of impermanence. Everything born dissolves, but humans want to hold on. And that very holding on makes us suffer. Many people believe that if they understand the cause of suffering, they will end suffering. But understanding with the intellect helps nothing, because the person doing the understanding is still the fearful mind, still the ego wanting to escape suffering to attain peace. The one wanting to escape suffering is still the root of suffering. When we hurt, the mind immediately intervenes. It finds reasons, finds methods, finds meaning. It says, this is karma, this is a challenge, I must overcome it to be liberated. But every explanation is a form of running away, because while we are busy interpreting, we do not truly feel the pain. Only when we stop running away, only when we have enough courage to look straight at suffering without naming it, without assigning meaning to it, without trying to turn it into a story. At that moment, suffering reveals its true nature. It no longer has power. We fear pain because we have never understood it, and we have never understood it because we always avoid it. Every time we avoid it, we accumulate another layer of fear. We fear emotions, fear memories, fear the past, fear even our own thoughts. So we begin to build a fake world, where everything is controlled, defined, named. But that world, no matter how bright, is just a gilded prison. Accumulation for the mind is chains. Chains made of gold, so we call them morality, knowledge, faith, happiness. But whether gold or iron, chains are still chains. The painful truth is that we do not fear suffering because it is terrible, but because it threatens the ego. The ego is built on memory, belief, and hope. When suffering appears, it shakes that entire structure. And to protect itself, the ego reacts by accumulating more, resisting more. But in that effort, we sink deeper into suffering. Suffering, if looked at without resistance, will dissolve, because its essence is not an entity but a movement of a bound mind. When that mind is no longer tethered by the past, suffering has nowhere to cling. Freedom from suffering does not lie in becoming better or nobler. It lies in silent understanding. Understanding that all suffering rises when the ego intervenes, when the mind no longer seeks, no longer resists, no longer accumulates. It becomes empty, and in that pure emptiness, peace appears like a flower no one needed to plant. Humans accumulate not just wealth, but also accumulate ideas, beliefs, memories, knowledge. They believe that when they have more, they will be safer. But what is safety? Safety is the feeling of not being threatened, not being lost. And when we need that feeling, we are already afraid. Every action directed towards safety is born of fear. We build society, laws, religion, organizations to be protected. But within those very systems, we are bound even more. Every time we find a shelter, we inadvertently build another wall. And then one day we no longer know what is outside that wall. We call the wall home, call dependence stability, and believe we have found peace. Yet late at night when all noise subsides, we hear our own sigh. That is the voice of the mind imprisoned in the very things it created. Accumulation brings a temporary sense of stability, but simultaneously sows the seed of permanent insecurity. Because whatever is accumulated can also be lost. Observe the mind. When it clings to a belief, it immediately fears other beliefs. When it grasps an idea, it fears opposing ideas. When it loves someone, it fears losing that person. And in that fear, love gradually turns into possession. Fear distorts everything purest. Suffering, when looked at deeply, is the cycle of accumulation and fear. We accumulate because we fear loss, but once we have accumulated, we fear being robbed. We hold tight to feel assured, but the more we hold, the more tired we become. That is the closed circle humanity has walked for thousands of years. In that circle, the mind finds every way to escape through faith, philosophy, action, resistance. But the paradox is that every effort to escape is born of fear, so ultimately, it just returns to the starting point. We try not to fear, but in that effort, we fear that we will fear. So how do we break this cycle? The answer lies not in doing, but in doing nothing, not giving up, but seeing. When we simply observe the accumulation taking place without interfering, without fixing, without setting goals, a miracle happens. The cycle stops itself because it only exists thanks to the energy of the observer wanting to change. Like a fire lacking fuel, when we no longer pour desire into it, it extinguishes itself, and in the remaining ash, we clearly see the nature of life. Everything comes and goes, nothing is ours. Yet the mind does not easily accept this. It is used to living in possession. This is mine, this is my idea, this is my faith. But that I is just a chain of memories protecting itself. It has no separate essence. When we truly see that, not with words but with direct, deep seeing, a strange silence spreads. In that silence, fear is gone not because we have defeated it but because we have no one left to fear. The fearful one disappears along with the illusion of I. Only the pure presence of awareness remains, in which there is no sufferer, nor anyone seeking liberation. It can be said that suffering ends when the observer is no longer separate from the observed, when we no longer stand outside fear to deal with it but become that very movement. Fear dissolves like morning dew dissolves under the sunlight. People often ask how to live without suffering. That question is like asking how waves cannot rise on the sea. Waves are the nature of the sea. But when we see that the sea and the waves are not two, the waves no longer bother us. Suffering no longer has meaning when we understand that we are not separate from it. That is the starting point of liberation. Not liberation from life, but liberation from the psychological bondage we created ourselves. In the silence of the non-accumulating mind, everything becomes clear. We no longer try to find happiness. because happiness is no longer obscured by fear or suffering. And in that moment, a peace spreads not because we achieved it but because it was already there, only covered by layers of thought and resistance. When all accumulation falls away, we lose nothing. We return to the clear emptiness, where there is no fear, no suffering, only pure life existing. Humans always find ways to escape fear. They turn to religion, philosophy, power, love, knowledge, anything that can bring a sense of safety. But paradoxically, every exit humans choose is just a form of running away. We do not truly escape. We just run in circles within the very cage of the mind. Fear, in its essence, is the non-acceptance of reality. We fear because we want something to be different, wanting life to comply with our wishes. When things are not as we wish, we suffer, and when we suffer, we begin to evade. That evasion can take the shape of morality, of religion, of noble ideals. But every effort to leave reality is the root of fear. Observe, when we fear loneliness, we immediately find someone to fill the void. When we fear mistakes, we cling to dogma for guidance. When we fear meaninglessness, we cling to ideals to feel our life has value. But in every such action, the ego is still operating. The fearful ego, the ego wanting to avoid. The escape is precisely fear operating in another form. We can call it identification. We identify ourselves with something bigger, a nation, religion, group of people, even a saint, to forget the smallness of the self. In that moment, we feel uplifted, strong, belonging. But in truth, identification is a form of self-deception. We are only changing the object of fear instead of fearing the loss of ourselves. We fear losing what we have identified with. People believe that becoming moral is the path of liberation from the ego. But if observed subtly, the more we try to become moral, the more we reinforce the moral ego. Morality based on will, on comparison and ideals, is always a product of thought, and thought is the root of the self. We can see this in daily life. The more one tries to appear benevolent, the easier they are angered when others are not like them. The more one believes they have the right faith, the more they fear when someone asks a different question. Because deep down, every effort to affirm the self contains the seed of fear. That fear is so subtle it hides even in things we consider sacred. We fear offending gods, fear not attaining enlightenment, fear not being good enough to be liberated. And thus, in every action directed toward liberation, we inadvertently create new chains. The true path of freedom lies not in becoming but in realizing. Realizing that the very person trying to become is the root of suffering. Realizing that every action stemming from fear cannot lead to peace. Only when we observe the mind without interference do we see it clearly, like looking at a crystal clear stream. We see thought arise. We see the desire to control. We see fear creeping in. And we just look, not choosing sides, not saying I will defeat it, nor saying I surrender to it, just looking. And in that pure look, fear begins to disintegrate. Because fear only exists when there is a fearer. When the fearer is gone, when the observer and the object being observed merge into one, fear has no place to cling. The ego, which is the center of fear, dissolves in the light of awareness. And when the ego is gone, what happens is not a cold emptiness, but a silence full of vitality. In that silence, life returns to its original purity. There is no longer a separation between us and the world, between fear and non-fear. Everything is just a single movement of life. People call that freedom, but that freedom cannot be achieved by effort. It cannot be found through methods or training. It comes when the mind no longer runs away, when it stays completely with what is. Accepting reality does not mean resignation, but seeing the whole of it without judgment. When we see the entire operation of fear, of the ego, of avoidance, then in that very moment we have transcended them. When we no longer run away, an extraordinary thing happens. Everything becomes clear without needing explanation. We do not need to name fear, do not need to break it down to analyze. We just stay with it like sitting next to a fire without trying to extinguish it nor seeking to keep it burning. And that look, the fire reveals its nature, rises, and then fades. When we observe fear without interference, we realize it always comes with desire. Desire for safety, desire for happiness, desire to escape itself. Fear and desire are two sides of the same coin. When one side disappears, the other also fades. Therefore, to end fear, one cannot hold onto desire. But letting go of desire cannot be done by will, because will is desire in a subtler form. The ego wanting to let go is still the ego seeking a result. Only when the mind truly sees this entire mechanism, when it sees that every effort is a game of itself, at that moment, a profound silence covers everything. In that silence, there is nothing to do, nothing to prove, nothing to attain. And then a miracle. Fear is gone, but we did not try to eliminate it. It fades like darkness fades when dawn arrives. Dawn does not fight the night. It just appears and darkness vanishes itself. When the ego dissolves, all concepts of the observer and the observed object also fade. Only pure life remains, recognizing itself. No I fearing, no I overcoming fear. Only the silent movement of existence, in which there is no suffering, no joy, no gain, no loss. That is the state of absolute freedom, where the mind is no longer bound by patterns. We no longer live by reaction, no longer led by memory or belief. We live like flowing water, soft, flexible, not clinging, not resisting. All fluctuations of life, joy, sadness, gain, loss, are just a breeze passing over the lake. The lake remains clear, reflecting everything but holding nothing. It is in that emptiness that joy appears, not the joy of achievement or victory, but the natural joy of presence. That joy belongs to no one, is created by no condition. It is like the fragrance of a flower, existing simply because that is its nature. One living in that state no longer seeks the meaning of life, because they have seen that life itself is the meaning. They no longer ask who am I, because that question only exists when there is still a questioner. When the ego disappears, no one is left to search. Only vast, clear, nameless silence remains. Perhaps the world will call it enlightenment, liberation. But those words are just symbols, unable to touch the truth. That truth cannot be described, cannot be learned, cannot be transmitted. It only reveals itself when the mind is completely silent, without the shadow of the experiencer. And in that moment, when we no longer resist anything, no longer crave anything, all fear melts like mist under the sun. The only thing remaining is the breath, is the light, is the nameless movement of the universe, where there is no longer a division between us and the rest. If it can be named, it is the freedom of the mind. Freedom does not come from opposition but from total understanding. No more effort, no more journey. The path ends where no one walks anymore because the walker and the path are inherently one. And when humans understand this, they no longer need to run from fear, nor need to seek happiness. They live simply, awake, sincere like a lotus blooming in mud without being tainted by mud. Because when the ego is gone, life returns to its inherent pure beauty. That is the place where fear, suffering, accumulation, and escape all dissolve into the void. Only the clear silence of the unconditioned mind remains there. No one asks if we are free yet because freedom is already the essence. And thus, when the ego ends, freedom begins.